Excellent!
So I have just received in rapid succession the MSI GTX 1070 Gaming X, which is my first 1070 ever. Then I got the Founders Edition GTX 1070 straight from NVIDIA. And then I got another MSI GTX 1070 Gaming X, or at least access to one temporarily thanks to my fencing partner Kyle from Awesome Sauce Network. So of course, let's just dive right into it. Here are some SLI custom GTX 1070 benchmarks. But first, a quick disclaimer. These cards are review samples. They were sent to us straight from MSI, and they're set to run out of the box in OC mode. That's one of 3 modes selectable from the MSI gaming app. The other 2 modes are gaming and silent. If you buy one of these cards at retail, you will need to get that app, go into it, and click the OC mode button to run at these same speeds, otherwise yours will run at gaming mode. I also figured that since MSI is definitely down for some overclocking, they shipped them to us in OC mode, by the way, and also because several viewers asked for it in my EVGA GTX 1080 for the win video, which you can see by clicking the card right up there. For this comparison, I would also use my GTX 980 Ti, but this time with a nice overclock to better match what you can get via the aftermarket cards that have just recently dropped significantly in price. Okay, with all that said, now, here are some GTX 1070 SLI benchmarks. 3D Mark Firestrike is a synthetic benchmark and it is well optimized for SLI, so we see great scaling from single card to two-way. Also check out that 980 Ti, doing much better with that overclock, which has it running at about 1422 MHz max. Unigine Heaven also scales well in SLI, and here especially at 4K we have over 90% scaling. Shows you what's possible for games that are designed for SLI with optimized drivers. Moving on to some actual games, Metro Last Light is still very much a challenge graphically speaking, but I'm guessing the drivers have not yet been updated for two-way SLI with this title on the 10 series, as scaling was pretty laughable. Crysis 3 definitely scaled better in two-way. We see nice gains at all 3 resolutions. I still think it's awesome that Crysis 3 at 1440 takes a GTX 1080 to hit over 60 frames per second on average. Still a monster title. GTA 5 also sees some decent SLI scaling at 1440 and 4K. As for those 1080 numbers, I'm pretty sure we're hitting a CPU limitation. There are still occasional stutters, unfortunately, hence the low minimum frame rates. And lastly, we have Rise of the Tomb Raider. This is in DirectX 11 mode right now since I didn't have time to try the different SLI modes for DirectX 12 with the 10 series. The 1070s do seem to get a bit of a boost in SLI, but not quite enough to beat a single 1080 at 1440 at least. So, kind of strange, but hopefully updated future drivers will provide more performance. So what have we learned from these benchmarks? Hopefully also, by the way, you guys like the new slides. I tried to make them a little bit easier to read, especially for anyone who might be colorblind. First thing I noticed is that I found the 980 Ti can definitely still hang, and that it really does take a GTX 1080 to beat one of these, especially if it's decently overclocked. I also learned that the 1070 is a beast as well, and when scaling played out, it hit some of the best numbers that I've seen with a two-way SLI setup, although granted I have yet to test two-way GTX 1080s. On the downside, we've reaffirmed that good SLI scaling requires both software and driver support, and that some games just don't gain much from adding a second card. It's this reason more than any other that keeps me from recommending multi-card configurations for most gamers. Finally, I should mention my SLI bridge, since the 10 series GPUs from NVIDIA have new requirements and a new high bandwidth SLI bridge. I didn't have an HB bridge, but fortunately you can use an LED bridge like this one from MSI. That's only for resolutions up to 4K. If you go 5K or beyond, you definitely need an HB bridge. But this one, if you're doing 4K, should work just fine, and according to my numbers, it did. Anyway, with the benchmarks done, I'm not really sure what to talk about next. That's okay though, we can take a closer look at the card, then we can do some overclocking and some temperature and noise test results as well. So the MSI GTX 1070 Gaming X has a custom PCB and cooler, and it sticks to the red and black theme that MSI has been using for quite some time. Aesthetically, the Twin Frozer 6 cooler does have some sharper edges and some additional texture details on the shroud, as well as LED lighting that's red along these sort of jagged protrusions by the fan, and RGB lighting on the MSI logo up on the top. For airflow, there's two 95mm double ball bearing Torx 2.0 fans, and for heat dissipation it uses 8mm copper squared heat pipes and a nickel-plated copper baseplate. The PCB redesign increases power delivery to a 10-phase array as compared to the 5-phase setup that's available on the reference board, and it adds another 6-pin power connector for higher available overall power draw. Being a 1070, it's got NVIDIA's GP104 Pascal GPU beneath the cooler. That is the same one that's used in the GTX 1080, but it is cut down to 1,920 CUDA cores and 120 texture units, resulting in raw compute performance coming in at 6.5 teraflops versus 8.9 on the 1080. You also get 8 gigabytes of GDDR5 memory. That's not GDDR5X like you get in the 1080. It runs at 8,000 megahertz effective clock speed though, and it is an open design on the MSI cooler, so in testing it did run cooler than the Founders Edition, but it will push more warm air out into your case, so bear that in mind. Back to the lighting though, you can adjust the MSI logo's colors via the MSI Gaming App software. That's the same software used to engage the OC mode, which has a basic set of effects options, but the only ones I really found usable, at least from an aesthetic perspective, were the static option and the breathing option. The logo LED will default to white and the red LEDs default to red if the gaming app isn't running, and being that the red lighting on the rest of the card is always red, finding matching colors for this RGB logo was definitely a challenge. I found that red and red or red and white were all that really looked okay to me. You can turn off the LEDs independently, which does give you a little bit more flexibility, but adding the second card just led to chaos. There's no sync option, so even though you can access all 4 of the lighting zones, that's 2 per card, individually, as well as the SLI bridge LED, which I actually thought was a pretty cool option that it can access that on its own, getting them all coordinated in a visually pleasing way was really next to impossible. You can either control all of them at once, which removes your ability to manipulate the RGB LEDs properly, or individually, which breaks any effect syncing. Hopefully MSI will update and improve the lighting control software in the future, I guess is what I'm trying to say. What about overclocking though? In SLI. I did that, and although I had a limited amount of time with the two-way setup, I still managed to add 115 points to the GPU, both GPUs, and about 80 to the memory. That let me hit an initial overclock of 2101 megahertz on both cards, but that then throttled back to about 2088 after the cards warmed up. Now, I was still monitoring throttling with a Unigine Heaven burn-in test, and as you can see, the cards do pull back from their initial peak frequencies, but only about 50 to 75 megahertz, so not too bad. Here is a benchmark test with the overclock going. I only had time to run Firestrike with this, but for the work I invested in it, I think I got a nice boost. Broke the 15,000 mark on Firestrike Extreme. My GPU temperatures stayed well under control with the MSI cards, 68C max under load with a single card, and 77 degrees Celsius for the upper card in a two-way configuration. If you're wondering about that GTX 980 Ti temperature, yes, it is a reference card I was using, but the fans were set to 70%, which kept it relatively cool under load. Fan noise for the Gaming X 1070s was quite minimal as well. They don't spin up at all at idle, which is pretty common these days, and under load with the OC profile, they only got up to about 40% speed. Here's a 0 fan mode speed test so you can hear ambient noise. Here the fans running at 40%. Here the fans running at 60%. And finally the fans at 100%. Next is a look at power draw, which I am still impressed with. Maxwell was already very power efficient, but comparing the 980 Ti here, you can see how far Pascal has really come. Finally, there is the price, and these Gaming X 1070s from MSI will cost you $460 each on Newegg, at least at the time of this filming, although granted none are in stock right now. I am told that stock availability will be improving within the next few weeks, so in July we should see more of these on store shelves, but what do you guys think of the actual price? It's a different situation this time around with the Founders Edition boards costing more than the non-Founders Edition boards, or reference versus non, but it still seems hard to actually find any 1070 GPUs that actually cost $380 as promised by NVIDIA at launch, let alone this one that costs more than the Founders Edition. Founders Edition costs $450, this is $460. Let me know if you guys think this card is actually worth it in the comments section down below, because I am curious. Personally, I think MSI has built a very nice card around the 1070, functionally speaking. It runs cooler and quieter than the reference card while offering faster stock speeds out of the gates. That said, I don't think their RGB lighting implementation really makes sense, as the red accents on the card limit what you can do with it. Also, the pricing seems pretty high at the time of writing, at least compared to NVIDIA's MSRP, and I definitely gotta knock MSI one more time for shipping these reviewer cards in OC mode, which just didn't really feel like it was on the up and up. As for SLI performance, it was impressive, but I would still opt for a single GTX 1080 over two of these, especially for $920 for two of these. The 1080 would be cheaper, and the games that would have great two-way GPU performance will be balanced out by the poorly optimized titles that show little, no, or even reduced performance when it comes to SLI. And so endeth this video, guys. Links to this card on Amazon, as well as my Paul's Hardware store where you can buy shirts, are down below. Hit the like button and get subscribed if you enjoyed it. And as always, thank you very much for watching.